8 years had passed since the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly ignited a nuclear war, when a new report landed on President Richard Nixon's desk. American spy planes over Cuba had spotted mysterious activity along the Bay of Cienfuegos, just miles away from Florida's shoreline. Submarine nets and anti-aircraft batteries suddenly materialized in the area. Nixon knew what this meant, but refused to tell the public. He knew the truth could send America into mayhem. The Soviets were about to unleash a weapon that could fool America's strongest defenses, travel hundreds of miles without being seen, one that could wipe an entire city off the map. America was on the brink of another Cold War catastrophe, only this time Nixon feared the Soviets might just get away with it. It was the morning of October 16, 1962, when National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy bolted into President John F. Kennedy's office, carrying a top-secret folder no American president would ever want to see. Inside were a series of photographs, which Bundy then spread across the desk. These were grainy aerial shots taken just 2 days earlier by a Lockheed U-2 spy plane hovering over San Cristobal in western Cuba. At first glance, the images looked like no more than scattered construction sites. But the CIA's analysis left no doubt. This was a Soviet intercontinental missile launch site in the making. Located barely 90 miles from Florida's coast, this was, without question, the deadliest outpost the Soviets had ever attempted. Kennedy knew it could not be allowed to become operational. America's future depended on it. Within days, dozens of U.S. warships were steaming toward international waters, forming one of the largest blockades in American history. Every vessel bound for Cuba would be stopped and searched. If as much as a single weapon or a missile part were discovered, the ship would be turned back. For Kennedy, it was a protective measure. For Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, it was outright piracy, and he would not stand for it. Tension rose by the hour. Defense officials warned the president the Soviet submarines were closing in on the blockade line. If they refused to surface, warning shots would have to be fired. What Kennedy did not know was that some of these submarines carried nuclear-armed Type 53-58 torpedoes, each holding about half the destructive power of the bomb that landed on Hiroshima in 1945. Moscow had authorized their use if the vessel came under attack, and on October 27th, the crews were ready to pull the trigger. After hours of pursuit by U.S. destroyers, Soviet submarine B-59 was at the breaking point. Its batteries were nearly exhausted, oxygen levels were plummeting, and the sweltering heat was knocking sailors unconscious one by one. Above the surface, American ASW forces circled relentlessly. Years later, B-59's brigade captain Vasily Arkhipov would recall the chaos, quote, "Overflights by planes just 20 to 30 meters above the submarine's conning tower, powerful searchlights, over 300 shells fired, depth charges dropped, destroyers cutting across our bow at dangerous distances, guns trained on us, loudspeakers demanding we stop our engines." With no contact to Moscow and fearing the worst, Captain Savitsky screamed to his crew, quote, "We will blast them now. We will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." In the end, it would only be Archipov's intervention that prevented catastrophe. Realizing the Americans were signaling rather than launching a full attack, he persuaded Savitsky to stand down from a nuclear strike. In the days that followed, diplomacy broke the standoff. Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba and to quietly remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, while the Soviets agreed to dismantle their launch sites. The world could breathe again. Yet the Cuban Missile Crisis had made it clear that during the Cold War, neither side could afford to let its guard down, and despite the temporary truce, neither nation would cease preparing for the ultimate battle. Not long after the 1962 crisis, the United States began to build a new generation of submarines that would serve as the ultimate guardians against future Soviet nuclear threats. The Lafayette class emerged as a family of nuclear-powered submarines built to carry the UGM-27 Polaris missile, a direct descendant of the Jupiter, America's first medium-range ballistic missile. The Polaris was redesigned to be more compact than its predecessor, yet each missile was as powerful as 1.2 million tons of TNT, strong enough to unleash a fireball that would vaporize everything at ground zero and spread devastation for miles. Yet it wasn't only their destructive power alone that made Polaris revolutionary. These missiles could be launched from beneath the ocean's surface, automatically correct their trajectory upon breaching the waves, and then travel nearly 2,860 miles toward their target, at speeds approaching 8,000 miles per hour. For the United States, this was an achievement that would completely rewrite the rules of nuclear deterrence. The promise was so great that some Navy leaders argued America no longer needed to rely on the Air Force's fleets of strategic bombers. Submarines armed with Polaris were virtually invulnerable, concealed beneath the water, able to bypass defenses and deliver a retaliatory strike from anywhere in the world. And the Lafayette class would not be alone in this mission. The moment they debuted, these submarines joined a larger fleet of vessels, known as the 41 for Freedom, which included the George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Ethan Allen, and James Madison classes. Built between 1959 and 1967, every member of this exclusive group was engineered to carry some of the deadliest nuclear weapons America had ever produced and transport them silently until it was time for their deployment wherever they might be needed. Washington hoped that this new line of defense would make the Soviets think twice before violating the Cuban nuclear agreement. But the Kremlin was not so easily scared. By the late 1950s and early 60s, the backbone of the Soviet undersea force rested on the Foxtrot and Hotel-class submarines. Both types could be armed with nuclear weapons. As had already been demonstrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Hotel-class even implemented nuclear propulsion to allow crews to endure longer operations across contested water. However, these predators still lacked the necessary speed, range, and striking power needed to deliver a decisive blow against the ever-growing might of the American fleet. From the moment the first American Polaris submarine sailed out of port, the Soviets began plotting the creation of a model that could counter them and ensure total control of the seas. They envisioned a completely new class of submarine, one that could prowl international waters with greater stealth, move faster while keeping a quieter propulsion, and unleash thermonuclear firepower equal to America's fearsome Polaris boats. It would not be an easy task, yet the engineers at the Soviet Naval Design Bureau, SKB-18, took on the challenge. How much captured intelligence these men had about the American technology they were trying to outdo remains uncertain. Yet, as their secret project, known as the 667A, took shape, its resemblance to the U.S. 41 for Freedom fleet was undeniable. In size, profile, and silhouette, the new Soviet submarines emerged as a near twin to some of the latest U.S. models, so much so that an American sailor seeing them surface on the horizon might easily mistake them for one of their own. Powered by VM-4 nuclear reactors, the new vessels could remain beneath the waves for months without the need to come back to recharge, and reach speeds of up to 27 knots, easily outrunning some of the most advanced submarines in America's ranks. Displacing up to 9,600 tons, the Yankee class had no problem carrying a terrifying payload of 16 R-27 ballistic missiles across international waters. Unlike the Americans, who relied on solid-fuel rocket designs, the Soviets adopted for liquid-fueled missiles. This made them more volatile, especially since the rockets were stored, carrying fuel at all times, but it also gave the crews the critical advantage of being able to launch almost instantly. A Yankee could fire its first missile within 10 minutes of receiving the order to strike, and every subsequent launch could follow in 8-second intervals, ensuring that no target had the chance to stage a counterstrike once the nuclear barrage had begun. Yet the Yankees were designed as more than just hit-and-run missile platforms. Equipped with advanced sonar, 6 533mm torpedo tubes, and the ability to stalk targets across the ocean, they could easily engage in open water battles against enemies who dared to challenge them. By the time the first of these boats joined the Soviet fleet in 1967, they were among the deadliest submarines ever created. Initially, strategic bases in northern Russia were chosen for their deployment, but soon the Soviet Navy began to crave for more. The Yankees were far too powerful to be confined so close to home waters. To truly take full advantage of their might, the Kremlin wanted them closer to the enemy, and soon their eyes once again turned to Cuba. On August 26, 1970, a U-2 spy plane was circling the southern shores of Cuba when a familiar image appeared on the systems of the crew, capturing images from the ground below. There, on the small island of Cayo Alcatraz on Cienfuegos Bay, the airmen had detected a previously unknown construction site. They immediately had a bad feeling about it. As American intelligence continued to monitor the area, American officials were able to confirm that Soviet flotillas were arriving at Cienfuegos with regularity, as the installations on the island continued to expand at an alarming pace. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger immediately reached out to President Nixon. The situation was not good. According to reports, the Soviet site had all the markings of a submarine base, one designed to host nuclear-powered submarines. Publicly, Nixon refused to give too many details, determined to avoid another wave of mass panic like the one that had engulfed the country during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Behind closed doors, however, he knew he had to act fast before the situation grew out of control. Reports from the time revealed that the site at Cienfuegos included fortified bunkers for housing nuclear payloads, an anti-submarine net across the bay's entrance, and anti-aircraft systems to defend against any aerial strike, showcasing just how committed the Soviets were to securing the base against attempts to halt its construction. In a memorandum to the president, Kissinger added more troubling discoveries. The facility seemed to feature living quarters and a full recreation complex, including a soccer field, basketball and tennis courts, as well as a swimming area. These additions suggested not a temporary outpost, but a permanent garrison, to which operators could likely be deployed to live and work for extended periods of time. Although the precise dimensions of the installation were initially difficult to establish, analysts estimated that it rivaled smaller U.S. naval outposts and likely surpassed 12,000 square feet of operational surface area, ample enough to host Yankee-class submarines and keep a steady rotation should the Soviets decide to keep alternating between the most advanced models of their underwater warriors. As questions began to mount from the press and public, Nixon moved to control the narrative. Specific details of the site and the government's response were kept under tight wraps. When pressed, Kissinger resorted to ambiguous remarks, stating, quote, "If the Soviets start operating strategic forces out of Cuba, say Polaris-type submarines, and use that as a depot, that would be a matter we would study very carefully." By mid-September, Kissinger called in the CIA to deliver a full briefing. It was no longer enough to keep an eye on the Soviet progress at the naval base. The White House needed a clear picture of what it was up against, and a strategy to stop Soviet nuclear submarines from ever reaching Cuba without plunging the world into another international crisis. Ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the unofficial pact between the United States and the Soviet Union, forged by Kennedy and Khrushchev, had held firm. America refrained from targeting Cuba, and the USSR avoided sending nuclear weapons to the island. However, as the first reports from Cienfuegos began to emerge, it was clear that if the new submarine base became operational, it would shatter the fragile agreement, and it would be just as menacing as if the Soviets had succeeded in planting land-based missiles on the island in 1962. According to analysts, this new naval threat would also be harder to counter. Unlike the older Soviet submarines that Kennedy's administration had faced, the new Yankee-class vessels, destined for Cienfuegos, could deploy much faster, and if the Kremlin ever chose to launch a surprise strike, American forces would have little time to react before the underwater attackers dispersed across the ocean's depths. Although the United States still possessed advanced sonar systems and capable submarine hunters, defending against this new menace would be a daunting task. The Navy would have to spread its forces thin along the entire southern and eastern coasts, endlessly hunting for a nearly invisible enemy, praying that none slipped through. Complicating matters even further, Nixon's administration was already alarmed by the rise of communist governments in Latin America, particularly in Chile, where Senator Salvador Allende, a self-described Marxist socialist, was emerging as the leading candidate for the presidency. U.S. officials feared that if he won, a totalitarian anti-American regime could soon take hold in South America. The situation threatened to destabilize the entire hemisphere. As New York Times journalist C.L. Sulzberger warned, quote, "If a legally installed hostile regime in Chile were even inferentially backed up by any kind of Soviet military installation in Cuba, the entire effort to arrange global detente between Washington and Moscow could be jeopardized. For several tense days, Nixon's inner circle was paralyzed. During one classified exchange, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird Jr. cut to the heart of the matter, asking Kissinger bluntly, quote, "What do we do from here? All hell's going to break loose." Unlike Kennedy 8 years earlier, Nixon knew a naval blockade was off the table. The Soviets were already accusing the U.S. of covertly plotting against Cuba, arming rebels, and undermining its government. To encircle the island again with warships would only confirm their suspicions, and with more than 70 nuclear submarines at their disposal, Nixon did not wish to invoke a retaliation from Moscow. To defeat this new crisis, brute force would not suffice. Now, the only way to avoid a second Cuban Missile Crisis was to give the Soviets a taste of their own brand of intimidation. It was November 27th when a U.S. Navy task force formed by the destroyers USS Perry and USS Allen M. Sumner entered into the waters of the Black Sea, pushing toward the Soviet Union's southern coastline. Just days earlier, while stationed in the Mediterranean, the crews had received a transmission from Admiral Thomas H. Maurer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The orders were brief. They were to break west, set a deliberate course that would take them within 39 nautical miles of Soviet shores, closer than what most American warships dared to. They were told not to strike, yet the destroyer's guns were kept pointed toward the USSR. Every sailor on deck knew what that meant. One word from Washington, a single command, and they would unleash hell. The operation would rage on for 6 days, in which the two destroyers would patrol Soviet waters, passing as nothing more than an already scheduled routine naval exercise, but which was indeed a warning to the Soviets. Nixon and Kissinger hoped that this quiet incursion would make it clear to Moscow that the United States would not tolerate the construction of a Soviet submarine base in Cienfuegos, and if the Kremlin would not listen to words, perhaps they would listen to the American guns at their doorstep. It did not take long for the Soviets to take the bait. Barely hours into the patrol, as the U.S. ships cut through the darkness, searchlights swept across the water, zeroing in on the destroyers' hulls. The Americans froze. Through the glare, they could make out a Soviet intelligence ship shadowing their every move and reporting back to its command. Moments later, a second vessel appeared on the horizon, this time a Soviet destroyer. It trailed the Americans at attack distance, its turrets pointing at them, as it mirrored Perry's every movement. The American crews watched silently, fingers brushing against the triggers of their own guns. Then came the sound, a low, growing roar from above. The men looked skyward to see 3 aircraft cutting through the night. Soviet planes on a direct course for the task force. One of them was unmistakable, a Tupolev Tu-16 bomber, sweeping low, barely 500 feet above the water. Its bomb bays were closed, but the sailors on deck feared they wouldn't remain like this for long. And yet, the Americans did not flinch. By the second day of the operation, the destroyer's sonar suddenly began to go off. A submarine contact, deep and closing fast. Then the blips on the radar multiplied. Another Soviet destroyer had joined the pursuit. The crews of the Perry and Sumner were now surrounded, and for a moment, not a single man dared to breathe. It felt like 1962 all over again, another potentially world-ending standoff. To fire against the enemy would have meant an inevitable tragedy, yet the sailors aboard the American destroyers could not allow the Soviets to trail them unchallenged for the remainder of the mission. Perry's commander gave the order. Electronic warfare was to begin immediately. Radio and EW teams snapped at their stations, and fingers flew over dials as the destroyer's transmitters flooded the airwaves with raw static. A wall of sound spread through the sea, bleeding into the same frequencies the Soviets used, while sonar operators shifted to aggressive active search patterns. The jamming would not force the underwater hunter to surface, but it would cut the submarine's link to its escorts and to Moscow, leaving its crew blind and giving the Americans precious time to complete their patrol without the constant threat of a torpedo coming to meet them from below. It was still no guarantee of safety, but it was the best the crews of the Perry and Sumner could do without pushing the confrontation past the breaking point. And when they finally cleared the Black Sea, not a single Soviet shell or torpedo had scarred their hulls. The mission had succeeded, at least in proving a point. It showed the Soviets that the United States would not hesitate to bring its naval power directly to their doorstep if Moscow refused to honor the promises made in 1962. But while the show of strength might have discouraged some nations, it was not enough to fend off the Soviets. Though they eventually halted construction at Cienfuegos, the Kremlin soon found a loophole. Perhaps they couldn't build a permanent submarine base in Cuba, but nothing in the agreements previously made with America forbade the use of tenders, floating support ships capable of refueling, repairing, and resupplying submarines at sea. To Soviet planners, these vessels did not constitute an official base, and they intended to exploit that gray area for all it was worth. In February 1971, American intelligence confirmed their suspicions. A nuclear-powered submarine had arrived in Cienfuegos, moored alongside a Soviet tender that served as its makeshift dock. Kissinger wasted no time. Furious, he reached President Nixon and informed him, quote, "Mr. President, they're really putting it to us. It's one of their games. They're just a bunch of thugs." Nixon knew what this meant, telling Kissinger, quote, "Well, here we go again." This time, though, the battle would not be laid on destroyers, but on diplomacy. Confrontations unfolded through back channels and negotiation tables, as Washington condemned each new Soviet naval movement in Cuba and tied them to ongoing arms control talks. Eventually, Kissinger's relentless pressure paid off. The Soviets agreed to an expanded understanding of the 1962 Accords, pledging not to deploy nuclear ballistic missile submarines to Cuba and to abandon the Cienfuegos base for good, ensuring that a second and far deadlier Cuban Missile Crisis never came to be. With the Cienfuegos submarine base out of the equation, the Soviet Yankee-class submarines were relegated to carry out patrols across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans in the decades that followed. Packs of them often prowled near the waters of Bermuda, a strategic zone the Soviets considered vital for countering the nuclear might of the United States and its Western allies. Though the Yankee fleet would never see real combat, they returned to the headlines in 1986, when a catastrophic accident nearly unleashed the nuclear nightmare that Kennedy and Nixon had fought to prevent years prior. It happened during what should have been a routine patrol near Bermuda by the submarine K-219. After years of dependable service, the vessel had begun to show its age, mostly ignored by a Soviet Union already sliding toward its inevitable collapse. A failure in the seal system allowed seawater to pour into the compartments containing volatile missile fuel. Within moments, a violent chemical reaction ignited, and before the crew could respond, an explosion tore through the sea. 2 sailors were taken out instantly, and one of the nuclear missiles was hurled into the sea. As the survivors fought to bring the vessel to the surface and free their trapped comrades, another crisis unfolded. The submarine's nuclear reactor, still active, was on the brink of meltdown. Automatic shutdown protocols had failed. Now someone would have to do it manually. With oxygen levels plummeting and the compartment filling with toxic smoke, men rotated through the reactor bay, each lasting only minutes before collapsing from heat and lack of air. Finally, it came down to one sailor, 20-year-old Sergei Preminin. Guided only by the instructions from the chief engineer, Preminin descended into the reactor chamber wearing a simple face mask. Alone in the darkness, he managed to complete the shutdown sequence, preventing a nuclear catastrophe. But as he turned to leave, the hatch refused to open. A fire had swept through the submarine, warping the metal and sealing him inside. Sergei Preminin never made it out. K-219 would eventually be lost to the deep, but Preminin's sacrifice had spared the world from a nuclear tragedy once more. In the years that followed, as arms reduction treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union took hold, the remaining Yankee-class submarines were gradually decommissioned, putting a definitive end to a fleet that, for a moment, had threatened to resurrect the specter of the Cuban Missile Crisis and bring nuclear fire closer to American shores than ever before.